So questions, theology, organization, whatever. I mean, we did this 2 years ago in Montreal, and it was designed to pick the hat brains for anything and everything. And in those ones, we generally will be talking about the mystical path, gnosis, theosis, hesychist stuff, whatnot. There was a pretty wide range of stuff. So, whatever you got, just, toss it out there, and chances are one of us will pick it up and run with it, and perhaps keep on running.
Christian has his hand up.
Oh, here comes
so does John.
Reverend Rick. Christian, go for it.
Okay, yeah. So this is this isn't my own question, although it was asked by somebody, and I'm more interested in the latter part, but I'm welcome to hear your answer to all of it. So basically, he asks, there are plenty of historical reasons to think that the sacrament of priesthood and apostolic succession, especially of the episcopal kind, are just not historically Gnostic, and in fact are pretty incongruent with Gnostic Christianity. Having been developed partly in opposition to it, why do you have both, and is your theology of them in any way different from the Catholic churches? And I'm mainly interested in that last part of the question, but I'd love to hear your answer to all of it on apostolic succession. So,
well, I'll take the first half, and then one of the other bald folks can take the second half. The first half is a pretty actually common question from people coming to Gnosticism or Gnostic Christianity for first time, particularly because everybody is used to kind of the shorthand historical stuff, thanks to things like Da Vinci Code and whatnot, of proto-Gnosticism and proto-Orthodoxy being in opposition, and that essentially because proto-Orthodoxy and then later small Orthodoxy proper, the Great Church, as some people call it, more firmly developed the idea of apostolic succession, or a tactile hands-on of who's in and who's out, that somehow it's kind of alien, foreign, or a cop-out for us to use it. But the actual historical reality is that it's the other way around. The Dr. David Brackey, who he's written several books, but he produced a fantastic course on Gnosticism for the teaching company, which is available on Audible. And I can't remember if he mentions this in his book or not. Mentions that the first actual instance of the use of lineage in holy orders as a part of kind of defining the authenticity, or at least igniting the authenticity, being the starting point for communities, comes from Gnostic communities, specifically the Valentinians, who kind of had the first lineage where you have Valentinus being ordained or trained by Theudas, being ordained or trained by Paul the Apostle. So it's actually the Gnostics that originate, in Brackey's opinion, right? I don't have a citation offhand, but I do know he dedicates a lecture to it in his course. But yeah, it's actually the Valentinians that developed that first. The other thing to note is that people talk about apostolic succession in very different ways, right? The one we're kind of most familiar with in the independent sacramental movement, and even in general kind of lay parlance, refers to that lineage of ordination. But depending on which church and where you go, some of that also refers to what Orthodoxy would call the deposit of faith, right? Do you hold to, whether or not you hold to the faith as delivered once and for all? That's probably almost a direct quote by the apostles. That determines if you're apostolic or not, and certainly that connects to later Protestant understandings of things. So for apostolic succession, sometimes you have common terms and uncommon definitions, where one uses it to refer to the deposit of faith, and the other uses it to refer to a lineage. Now, in terms of lineage, because that's the more common usage, it did originate with the Gnostics, and one of the reasons why we maintain it is to avoid, I guess, there's no way to talk about it without being somewhat crude, right? Is to avoid a degree of name it and frame it, right? That somebody isn't necessarily just pulling this out of their butt and saying, I'm an authority now. That there is a degree of vetting, and this is true of lineage and esoteric communities, right? That the ordinations are individual, but the decisions are largely communal, right? And that is true even in a top-down hierarchy in the AJC. The decision is made in harmony with the local community. If the local community doesn't think their local person should be ordained, they're probably not going to be ordained. So there has to be a meeting in the middle on that. So ordination and license and lineage is essentially a safeguard. Community is an antidote to insanity or a lack of qualification. Now, that's not to say that stuff doesn't happen. As Monsignor Jordan Stratford says, for $5 and a cup of coffee and a pop-up cathedral in a bus stop, you can probably get ordained by somebody. Nevertheless, we maintain it because it is a degree of quality control and a degree of vetting that, as the ancient saying goes, they who are to preside over all must be approved of by all. And so we maintain that presence, and ordination and lineage is a part of the seal, by which that happens, if that makes sense. I hope that answers the first part of the question.
Yeah, I think that does a pretty good job of it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but later Valentinianism, there was sort of they started essentially allowing more and more people, correct, into that lineage, if I'm not mistaken. Would that maybe be possibly because of the persecution of the church, or?
I'm not actually sure. I do know that out of the competing, and I hate that word competing because it's more like they're parallel. Out of the competing communities at the time, the Valentinians obviously had a degree of popularity because you could go to regular church, right? They didn't discard the regular church. They incorporated it, and they esotericized it in the sense they said, okay, we've now heard the lesson, we've now had communion. How do we understand that deeper? So, there was, it happened in combination, at least I understand it. And you have to remember that because I work on administering seminary, I tend to read the same books over and over. So I don't always keep up to date on the latest stuff. So I trust other people to do that. But in my understanding, they didn't create themselves, in opposition to the church. They built on the church. They were a part of the church. They were regular Christians. Now, in their theology, they made some distinctions. Like you have the Heilig or Hulik, depending on how you pronounce it. My pronunciation is crap. You have the Heilig, psychic, and pneumatic, as forming kind of types of people, and kind of their level of, I guess, it wouldn't be access to the sacred flame or divine spark, but kind of innate realization or ability to progress. And so, of course, Dr. Bean is, there's a quote he said years ago that I'm fond of re-quoting. He said, I mean what everybody means when I say more enlightened society, more like me. The Valentinians, of course, likely saw themselves as the pneumaticoi, right? The people at the top of that threefold division. However, they didn't view their fellow Christians as being Heilig, as being base, as being irredeemable. They viewed them in the middle stage, folks for whom initiation, for whom gnosis, for whom evolution was possible with work, discipline, and dedication, right? And the very fact, the proof was right in the pudding, given that they attended church side by side with them. They wouldn't do that if they thought that process was worthless, right? So there was another point I was going to mention. It goes back to something that my predecessor, Bishop Foster, said years ago, talking about, why the lineage, why the organizational structure versus the experience of gnosis. If the experience of gnosis is all you need, why all this other stuff? And he kind of defined it in Buddhist terms, that you had essentially what he called the primordial lineage, the experiential lineage, and the organizational lineage. The primordial lineage is the experience of gnosis. It is the thing that lights the fire under everything. The experiential lineage, or level perhaps we could say, are those techniques or methods or disciplines or paths that are found to lead to the primordial, an experience of the primordial. The organizational lineage is the codifying of the experiential lineage in order to weed out practices that are unsafe, people that are unsafe, so on and so forth, right? And so while you don't need the organizational one, when you take it away, when you break apart that community or take away that lineage, there's a path that's closed off, or if not closed off, it becomes more dangerous to walk because you do it outside of community without the benefit of the wisdom and experience of the people around you, right? So when people say, well, why have a church? Why have a community if all I need is this, magical experience? That's why, right? And I mean, it's no different than, I mean, look at my fat arse, for example, right? For some people, all they have to do is turn their head and, burn calories. For me, I've got to walk 10 miles a day and watch what I eat, right? I mean, the methods to a degree, are as different and as varied as there are people. So the communal approach, the lineaged approach, that kind of vetting and reinforcing, and also an opportunity to see the divine in the face of other human beings, because we will certainly, at least in my own ignorant experience, I more readily see it in somebody else than I do when I look in the mirror when I brush my teeth in the morning, right? Because I'm fully possessed of all my flaws, or should be, right? People should be aware of all that. And so I know a lot of the ways in which I fall short. So it's easy when I look at community, when I look at people around me, when I look at that chain of teachers and that chain of people, that chain of experience, it is easier for me to see and experience the face of the divine in that. So that's basically a long, winding road, kind of tying together, I guess, the experience of gnosis. Why have a church? Why have a lineage in that church? I guess to wrap up that stuff. And I guess that kind of stumbles partway into the part B of the question. What separates? What separates us from other Gnostic churches or from other churches?
It was specifically, what's different about your succession than the Catholic succession?
Almost nothing. Almost nothing. I mean, we have
more.
Yeah, we have more. I guess you can divide it into two parts, and this came up in the Facebook group the other day, and Monsignor Jordan answered it more to the point than I did. But essentially, I mean, there's two blocks of lineages, right? There's the modern stuff that comes out of the Gnostic churches during the Gnostic revival in the 19th century, which is based on visionary experiences derived from there, and ordinations coming out of that. And then there's the mainstream apostolic succession. And at one point functionally we can say around 1804, but definitively for everybody, 1913, those two streams came together, and now they'll never be separated. There exists no bishop, no parish, no church anymore that solely carries only the modern Gnostic lineage. Every Gnostic church has regular apostolic succession, as it were. Now, I guess, and sorry, what separates our use of lineage, or what separates us entirely?
Mainly just lineage. I mean, I can see how it's separated from Catholicism, church.
I hope so.
Yeah, that part's not too hard. But yeah, just mainly how the apostolic succession is different was his question. I'm guessing also.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that also I guess
is more legalistic than anything else, because the particular requirements that are necessary to pass on apostolic succession in the Orthodox tradition and in the Catholic tradition involve, so for example, in the Orthodox tradition, there has to be, you have to be consecrated as a bishop to a particular see. If you're not, then it's not valid. In the Catholic tradition, it has to be in conformity with the codes of canon law. So there are these legal distinctions. So, for example, an ordinary Catholic might not consider our succession to be valid because it is outside of the legal, the canon law definition of how succession is passed, and this is what created the sort of distinction of valid but illicit, where we understand the power of the bishop to pass on succession to be more or less unlimited. That they're not confined by any particular set of canons or legal codes aside from the tradition as a whole. But in other faith communities, there are distinctions that are made that are stricter. Now, in the case of the AJC, if I were to ordain or consecrate somebody, that would be valid, and nobody in the AJC would dispute the validity of that ordination. I would also be kicked out because I had just violated my own oaths and my own vows to respect the canons of the church. So we're not exempt from that, but we don't generally deny validity of other orders on the basis of our legal definitions.
Yeah, I was going to say there is that distinction. You'll hear it a lot with the independent churches, the distinction between something being valid or effective and something being licit or illicit, allowed, right? So a good example of, validity versus laicity would be driving, right? The difference between being able to drive and having a license are two different things. The other crude example of something that might be valid but illicit, murder. Now ordination is not that. So, though some days it kills me. But there you go. And I mean, everybody, Christianity, Western and Eastern Christianity generally have set through implicitly across the board and explicitly in some cases, have set kind of standards for what determines validity. Whether it's listed or not is generally up to, individual churches. I mean, in the Roman Catholic Church, it's not listed if a bishop is ordained by any less than 3 bishops, right? But in the Eastern Orthodox Church, if a bishop leaves the Eastern Orthodox Church and then consecrates another bishop, that consecration is deemed to be invalid because there's no ordination outside the church, right? So but Rome does differ on that. They say that heretics can be ordained. This comes out of a historical episode that after Roman persecution, where the authorities compelled clerics at the time to offer incense to the emperor because the emperor was deified at that point in time, or semi-divine. And those who refused, the question after that persecution passed and Christianity was at least legal, maybe not fully accepted, because there's about a 50-year difference between it being legal and it being the religion of the state. Those things didn't happen at the same time. So the people who came out of that persecution, some members of the community said, these guys did a bad act. Essentially, they offered obedience or incense or offerings essentially to an idol. Therefore, their baptisms they've lost their baptism. They've lost their ordination. And so it became a dispute in Christianity where, if somebody does a bad thing or, breaks the rules or apostatizes or falls into heresy, do they actually lose the benefit of the sacraments they had already received? And Christianity across the board determined that no, that wasn't the case. The side effect of that, though, meant that at a later date, when the Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox go their separate ways, when the Western Church, splits into three different popes, in the 13th, 14th century in the Great Western Schism, when East and West in 1054, split up, and when, some guy kept whacking heads till he found the wife he wanted, is that it creates new churches indisputably, right? The consequence of that acceptance 1,000 years prior means that these churches, when they break away, are valid by the definition of their own theology. And so now good news, the communities get to continue. Bad news, we now have 27 or 30,000 denominations of Christianity. So, a little good, a little bad, right?
Interestingly, the exact opposite sort of position was taken by the Cathars, who suggested that if you lost your status for whatever reason as a parfait, not only was your sacramental power null and void, so was the sacramental power of everyone to whom you had given it. So your entire lineage gets sort of erased if you fall into to apostasy or something like that. If His Eminence is a parfait and makes me a parfait, then and I'm not talking about ice cream here, right? Then he falls into to apostasy. I have to go fix my lineage, or else I'm as sacramentally devoid as he is.
It's a chain of falling dominoes.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite sort of position.
And how pissed off would you be if, 5 steps down the lineage, if Bob from accounting screws it up on a Wednesday, and now all of a sudden, a whole community of people have to go get reordained? I mean, when the Cathars, the Cathari, the perfected ones, the pure ones, kind of took their name seriously. That's a rather hardcore kind of extension of that early Christian problem, as to if you lose, if you sin, you lose grace. But the reality is knowing humanity. If that was the case, if that was the theology, the church would have died out 2,000 years ago. Right, probably the second after Jesus screws off, to be honest, if not before. Right, I mean, considering that if we take the canonical, narrative, Christ was still around and Peter still managed to screw it up. Yeah. It's literally right in front of his face, and he dropped the ball. But it's also telling that after all those shenanigans happen and people have egg on their face, rather than coming back and condemning them, saying, you stupid idiots, Christ just says, receive the Holy Spirit, and gives them some mojo. I would like to think, not ignoring those flaws, but because of those flaws, right? The apostles are exceptional because they are ordinary.
There is also, I think, on a sort of related question, the problem of the historicity of succession, and I think the question of the relationship between mythological history and real history is at play here, because one could say, well, even if the chain of succession is not fully unbroken, the myth, the story that we tell is what's important in this, and we've maintained it at least for the last couple of hundred years. But I actually have a tendency to think that the historical chain of succession, despite our lack of evidence, is probably fairly intact, because we can trace succession back a couple of hundred years, and not more than about 400 years. But at that time, I'm sure that they could have traced it back another couple of hundred years, which means, we could probably trace it back, maybe, 400, 500, 600, 700 years. And at that point, right, they would have been secure, that they would have been able to document the last couple of hundred years. And so unless we assume that at some point there was a real break in the lineage and a bunch of people got together and decided to lie through their teeth about their succession, which is not impossible, right? Then there's good reason to believe that the historical succession goes back at least a pretty significant way. So I have a tendency to think that the historical aspect of it is something that we ought also to take seriously.
I was going to say, I can add to that in that it goes actually back provably at least 500-600 years, right? There was a guy who did some research some years ago, Bransom Charles, who did documentary stuff for the Roman Catholic Church, and something like 91 or 95%, I think it's 91%, of all Episcopal ordinations in the Roman Catholic Church go back to one guy, Cardinal Scipione Rebiba. And that's about 600 years ago. And he was the guy responsible for ordaining one of the many Pope Pauls. The only thing is they can't find a record of who ordained him. But we can assume that it's historically intact simply because the communities have continued to exist. Right. Even in esoteric, more initiatic, more mystically focused churches, I would like to think, anyway, but even in the more fringe churches, ordination is a public act, right? It is something that happens. Ideally, you have people there. It's it's a documented thing. It happens in plain view, right? In front of the people for whom that person is going to serve, right? So so because there's a public record of continuity of the community itself, you can assume that the lineage goes with it. I would say that instead of saying, a whole generation or a group of people would have to lie about it, I would say an entire generation would have to be wiped out in order for that to happen, because the amount of continuity, is a historical reality. Now, historically, is that possible? Yes, absolutely. You look at the Black Plague, right, which wiped out something like a third of Europe, and particularly took out older folks. How timely for today. And so you have entire generations of knowledge and skill being wiped out in a shot, right? So you have elder statesmen, elder doctors, elder practitioners of their particular fields being wiped out, and now all of a sudden, in that system of apprentice, journeyman, master for whatever it is, whether it's the church or the guilds or that kind of thing, all of a sudden, everybody moves up, but the knowledge doesn't necessarily move with them, right? You now have journeymen who are masters who otherwise wouldn't necessarily be masters. So a generation of knowledge gets wiped out and essentially sets civilization back. It's entirely possible, and there's no way for us to know that the church likely, could have fallen prey in some parts to same versions of that. Now, coincidentally, there is an interesting thing that happened during the Black Plague, the practice of absolute ordination. There were people who were being ordained to only do one thing, say mass for the dead. That's it. And in some cases, some of them couldn't even read. Right? So, it's just a matter because people knew the prayers.
Too, so.
Sorry?
That's true of our priests too. So
yeah, because people knew the liturgical actions, because they knew the mass, because everybody grew up with it, and at that point in time, the mass, at least in the West, was all in the same language, right? You didn't need to be able to read in some cases to do the mass, much in the same way that you have all the information and knowledge essentially kind of being copied out and preserved in monasteries. Those monks weren't necessarily literate, right? But they can copy words as symbols. They can copy, they can trace, they can do whatever. So they're essentially copying something they don't understand. So there's every reason to believe that, some version of that, kept the church going through a possible break. that's a lot of history for, for a two-part question. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I enjoyed it. I'll let some other people ask some questions if anyone has some. If not, I've got some more, but
I would just clarify. When we talked about after 1913 and everybody had everybody's ordination, therefore, His Eminence said that every Gnostic church has apostolic succession. There is one noteworthy exception, which is the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, as currently operated by the OTO. It's definitely inside baseball. You go into the minutia, but there was another organization with that name. The current organization has no relationship, historical or otherwise, with that, and so it would sort of be like you and I just pretending to be the Church of Latter-day Saints and just starting this, in our garage. So there's no continuity in that particular church, but those guys are interested in Crowley and Thelema, and they're not really interested in Gnosticism anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But there's just that one, because you're going to run into them through Googling and through conversation. But what they are doing is not what the rest of us are doing.
On another note, if anyone's anyone's interested in starting the Gnostic Mormon Church, I have both mainstream and Mormon fundamentalist priesthood lineages. So got that? Woo!
Well, so do we. So yeah, there was an interesting fellow, I don't know, about 100 years ago. He had came off of a fundamentalist thing. It was out of the groups that refused to give up polygamy. And he ended up doing a whole bunch of things. So he was a Mormon, I think he was a Thelemite, and I think he was a Druid. And he ended up creating a thing, Conway or Shreves, one of those guys. I mean, I've got all this stuff somewhere. But anyway, so this guy was a combo of a whole bunch of things, namely Mormonism and I think Thelema of all things. I mean, two great faiths.
That's a heck of a combo.
Yeah, I know. Every man and woman is a star, and their wives too. And so there was a breakaway lineage there that came into the independent sacramental movement. So there's some Mormon mojo floating around. No golden plates, however. Jason, sorry, you had a question.
Yes. This is, it was just, like, it's not even I just thought of this question now after hearing you guys kind of go on about the lineage there, which, like the different groups involved, etc., and like valid, illicit, etc. Honestly, this is just like, I'm just freewheeling. Where does authority come into play? Like if you're claiming lineages, do you also need to follow the authorities of the places those lineages come from?
That's a good question, and that's a debate that's actually played out in some of the churches that Jordan, referred to, because there are a few churches, for example, claiming to be the one true French Gnostic Church, and most of those are neither French nor Gnostic nor a church. I always look forward to the opportunity to say that because it's bloody true. So the question is that because the lineage, particularly for newer Gnostic churches, come out of specific movements that at one point in time were unified, right? At one point in time there was one or close to one and a half, one and a blob, French Gnostic Church. Because that split up into different churches, which one, will the real one stand up? Because they all claim to be the legitimate, successor of their predecessor movements. And even then, there's more than one church with the word Johannite in its name, right? So whence cometh authority? And I mean, when the history is within living memory, it's a little bit easier to sort when you have documentation, but it's still an issue for the wider thing, right? Because everybody's got Roman Catholic lineage or Eastern Orthodox, But we're clearly not Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. We can make no claim on that. We can only claim to validly ordain by their standards with their lineage. They would disagree. We can only claim that. That doesn't mean we are them. So with these guys, how does that work out? And I talked about some of this in one of my Palaprat, Bernard Raymond Faber Palaprat talks. How do you decide? And a lot of the claims are very similar. They rival each other, and there's actually legitimate points made by all involved that they all have a legitimate, connection to say that we are a valid extension of said church, the generation before us. I think I think the only way you can answer the authority question is simply to look at what they're doing. Are they doing the work? Are they being a church? Are they actually a community, right? Do they say more about how great they are in the lineages they have than where you can get a sacrament, a cup of coffee, an ear, or a companion to a doctor's office, right? What are they actually doing with it? At one point in time when things were underground and secret, and this is true of esoteric societies, the thing that separated us, and I'm using that broadly, from the world was the secrecy, was the hidden nature of it, was the underground quality of it, by necessity, for safety's sake, right? And now, because everything's, out in the open and in the phone book and on the internet, what separates you out is what you do, right? Not unlike, the idea of, gnosis. So you have gnosis, so you have an experience. Now, what do you do with it? How do you translate that into action? What does that actually do? Transformation, as somebody once said, isn't what happens, 5 minutes before a service when you're in the church parking lot before you go in the door for whatever, where you leave all your bad stuff behind and suddenly you're goody two shoes, right? It has to be thorough and interpenetrate, the entire of your being, right? As we talked about during, Bray's talk, the lex orandi, lex credendi, how you pray is what you believe, what you do to a certain degree. And I mean, this is shorthand. I'm cutting the corners off stuff when there is nuance here, but in this regard, what you do to a degree is who you are. Everybody has lineage. Everybody has that mojo. Where are they applying it? What are they doing it? Whom does the Grail serve? For whom are they doing it? Right. And, and even if it's only one person, but it's in a meaningful way for the person who has sought that, then, then that's authority, right? I mean, lineage may come in a chain, and ordination may come from on high, but authority only ever comes from the assent of the community, right? I may be, the world's most benevolent dictator, as Dr. Behan has once noted, but everybody can vote with their feet. Authority.
At the end of the day, that question of authority is one that's decided by historians and communities more than by people in the moment. Because if we claim to be a Johannite church, the reason that history will confirm that is because we're doing this, is because we have functional parishes, because we're doing the liturgy, because we're offering the sacraments, because we're doing the work. There might be 1,000 other churches with equally valid apostolic succession that claim the name Johannite, but at the end of the day, right, when all is done and dusted in 100 years, nobody's going to remember that they existed.
I can't even remember half of them now, but that's just me.
Just to go even further, I guess maybe with my question, I think I'm also interested in the question of authority from those bigger sources, those more distant sources that a lot of people are claiming lineage from, like in terms of like. So I guess I'm asking the question, like, I think I know the answer, but I'm also kind of thinking that this is a good question to have answered publicly, maybe, is like, if the Catholic Church decides to do something really terrible now, are you obligated to follow that because you guys share lineage? Because there's a claim to authority there.
Yeah, the Rome has no authority over us simply because we share a lineage. All that means is that the AJC and the Catholic Church are part of a single greater, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So the fact that the Orthodox and the Catholics share a lineage, and in many cases they do, doesn't mean that Rome has any authority over Constantinople. So, or Canterbury or anybody else. So what the lineage suggests is that we are part of a larger family. It doesn't mean that we derive our authority from that part of the family. We derive our authority from the family.
I was gonna mention there was and this connects to some of the stuff actually that I've seen talked about on the ever wonderful Esoterica channel of Dr. Justin Sledge. He makes he's involved in Reformed Judaism, but there was a quote he had mentioned which comes from one of the figures there that says the past gets a vote, not a veto. And so, tradition and our connection to older, bigger churches, of course, has an influence. We're not bound to it, but at the same time, we don't want, in some regards, like for example, our baptisms, we don't want to be so far out of step that we can't work together with other churches because we're unrecognizable. So the idea of tradition and our larger mainstream cousins, it's got a vote, it's got a voice. It doesn't have a veto. We're not bound to it. Case in point, they some people like really ugly fiddleback chasubles. We don't. So don't get any ideas, Brendan. No guitar masses either. The other thing I think it's important to note before we get too wrapped up in our heads about lineage and stuff is that God can do what God wants. And, as I said once in an address to another esoteric group, right? All the lineages, all the titles, all the whatever in the world, if you don't have character, if you don't have quality, if you don't have actual service and ministry, none of those things will give it to you. And if you have those things, if you're honestly serving people, if you're honestly working to build community, if you're honestly working to make a difference, the lack of those things will not hinder you whatsoever, right? So there are plenty of valid churches that fall outside of that stream that have centuries of really good work that don't fall within that bracket. And, and I would never say that they're not a church, they're not ministers, and their ministry isn't real. It's just different, as like Jordan says, what we do and what they do are different things.
I think
does that?
Sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to say that answers my question, but it also helps me answer that question when I'm talking to the public or anybody that I encounter, because I think there is, I know it was a much earlier question for me, not a heavy one, but it's also when I discuss it with my friends and family, when they hear lineage, they think authority often. So it's just, you've given me a way to describe that, which I appreciate. Thank you.
No worries. Christian, did you still have a question? Because I saw your hand was up. Else I'll just push the button to lower it.
No, you can go ahead and lower it.
Okay. Park, you had a question?
Yeah, in light of the conversation that you guys have just had, and in light of His Grace's talk just before about the role that Gnosticism has in the world right now and the importance of what AJC might be able to bring to it, I'm curious what the AJC's thinking is around growth, about where the church is moving in the future.
Oh, that's a hard one to nail down. I mean, we're not.
It's been a matter of a lot of discussion, and certainly there are people in the church who would like to see us grow much larger. There are some who are very comfortable with keeping it very, very small. I tend to fall in the latter camp, but I think nobody is in favor of growth for the sake of growth. So that's I think the one thing that we can all agree on is we're not successful because we've got the big numbers. We're successful because we're doing the right thing. That said, I think all of us also would love to see more pins on the map, and would love to see more people who hear the call of a vocation in the AJC, and just more people who hear the call of showing up on Sunday morning or Saturday night or Wednesday afternoon. That we do want to grow, in the sense that we would love to reach out to more people who could benefit from what it is that we do. But the idea of being a larger denomination on the sort of world scene, there are some that think that that's a possible and a worthwhile goal, and that it can be done without diluting our identity and our message of who we are. But there is legitimate disagreement about it, and I think that the reason that we have taken the fairly restrictive course of action that we have, in terms of keeping our standards for our clergy and our seminarians extremely high, vetting seminarians very, very carefully, and so on and so forth, that practice is going to limit your growth to a certain extent, but it's also going to ensure quality. And that means that you ensure longevity. And growth does not necessarily mean longevity. In fact, in many cases in the business world, we see that unrestrained growth is problematic in terms of long-term viability. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with wanting to have more parishes and more people and more clergy and more laity, but certainly nobody in the AJC, I think, would want to grow for the sake of growth.
I would add to that, because I think it dovetails well, though the direction I'm coming from might be a little bit different. But I mean, I've been in this chair now for 17 or 18 years, and my kind of approach, I mean, I started as a priest in the AJC, so I didn't found the church, I just lead it now. And I think one of the things that, I noticed as a priest in the kind of Gnostic church world around me, and, and one of the things that I kind of resolved to do differently once I found my legs in the role, is, not the flashy stuff, but the basic stuff. Be where you say you're going to be. Do what you say you're going to do. Serve the people that are in front of you, right? And for all the Gnosticism and occultism and all these fancy things, secret lineages, hidden masters, ascended wisdom, sparkly, whatever, there's a basic human component that must be served before all. I mean, those things are fun to geek out and talk about, but, there are real human beings with, real needs and pastoral needs that need to be attended to. So I've always been of the mind that if you do those things and you do them consistently and you do them correctly and sincerely, the rest will take care of itself. I mean, I am a human being existing in some place and some time, with the limits of my own experience, with the limits of my own bias, with the limits of my own perspective. There are lots of people, by virtue of, loving history books, loving fiction books, having a teenage history of better living through chemistry, any number of experiences that I've had that are going to resonate with another person and say, hey, this person is just like me. But there's a limited number of those people. There are people that I can reach simply by being myself, but it's only so many people, right? So I don't try to reach, beyond that scope. I try to serve the people that are in front of me. I'm not going to be able to reach everybody. The people who are going to reach beyond the length of my own arms, as it were, will be the people I am serving now, right? I don't have to reach those people. The people will reach those people if those people are served correctly, if that makes sense, right? So we build the church for the people we have, not the people we'd like to have, because sometimes that's a moving target, right? You have, one of the lessons that we can learn from the larger, older mainstream churches is to take things slow, right? That they haven't risen or fallen based on fads, fad diets or fad anything, or the secret, that kind of stuff. They've done what they've done, kind of consistently. They haven't chased a kind of human version of get rich quick, right? So, we serve and build, the church we have for the people that we have. And I think if those people are served correctly, honestly, and sincerely, to the best of our ability and resources, those people are going to reach the people beyond them that by virtue of my own experience, I would never be able to reach, right? I don't have to draw the circle this wide. I just have to draw it this wide. And the people who are on that boundary, who are on that margin, can draw it wider still, right? So that's kind of the, and we all have limited time and resources and, and ability. I mean, we're all volunteers. Many of us, work second secular jobs. And so we also want to have a measure of endurance in the marathon, right? Be careful about, who we pass the baton to, that they've got a similar kind of, staged or stamina based, approach. So I think, we always like to plant the flag in new places. We always like the ability to reach, new people. But I think, we try to shore up that pole, as it were, every time we plant it, so we don't have to plant it again. And because the other thing is, we're a Gnostic church, and yes, we're built atop several other movements like Christianity and esotericism and Gnosticism. And so, like I was saying in a comment on an earlier presentation, the stories are familiar, right? Whether we're talking the Grail myths, we're talking Celtic myths, we're talking Gnostic myths, everybody knows some version of them. That's not the new thing. There isn't a new way to tell that story. But the new way to tell that story is not the story itself, but what the story did for you. And the people can do that where the stories can't. So I think if we honestly, my dog is going crazy. I think if we honestly serve people and create a space for that experience, that sincere, honest, and authentic spiritual experience to create itself, they will be able to sincerely and authentically transmit it to something else. Real gives way to real. I mean, could we do it faster? We could do it faster, but it would also be shallower. It would be less substantial. It would be less meaningful. So I think finding that middle point between, efficiency and stability is kind of generally what I've tried to go for, during my time. And it's a balance, because even if you think you have a exact formula that works, in terms of where to place your feet and how much weight to put on them, the ground underneath you will shift and you will have to change. So we also believe in being adaptable. I mean, if we didn't, we wouldn't be having an online conclave. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I don't know. Will and I have been doing the talking, so I don't know if Tim's on the same page, although I suspect he might be. But that's generally kind of the approach we've tried to take. Leave the door open, leave the light on, leave a seat at the table, and serve people honestly when they get there. And that experience will replicate itself. People are incredibly smart, and despite what you may see, in the news of masses of people, individuals are getting smarter and more educated and more wise in many respects. And even if they're not, I believe that the right foot to place our weight on is to trust that people can sniff bullshit, right? Would I want our church to be populated by people who can't, right? So I make that assumption of them, and they will do me credit, and they will live up to it and then some, and outdo me, right? So so give them a sincere thing, because they can smell when it's off, right? And they'll be able to transmit that thing sincerely in turn from their own perspective and experience. So I guess if I were to, because I always use 50 words when 5 will do, my approach has always been organically, naturally, mouth to ear, hand to hand, heart to heart, eye to eye, as best as possible. I mean, the everything we have here was built by the experience of one person to another, one person at a time. And from here, looking out to the future, that may look like a long time, but now we're looking at 20 some groups over the course of 20 years with a library of resources and media and pastoral service and all these things. You look back and you go, okay, that actually wasn't that bad. And we didn't have to be less real to do it. So organically, that's the short answer. Sorry. Does that help?
I like your answer very much. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I saw John put a comment in about speaking of getting rich. John, it's John's job to get us rich. He's our treasurer. So. And the less I have to think about money, the better we all are, because I'm not very good with budgets. More questions?
I guess if nobody else has anything, to kind of, I'm fairly newly introduced to the AJC, and so it's kind of a big question, and I'm not sure if you guys are uniform on this, but afterlife, what, where do you guys, is there different subscriptions within the church as to what that is, or is it fairly uniform?
Ask 3 Johannite's that question, you'll get 4 answers.
Yeah. Okay. There's one of those things, and this kind of goes back to some of the questions that we have on the website. There are, people, have occasionally wondered if we're hiding things, because there's only so many positions, that we take on things. And the afterlife is one that we have, left to the individual experience. Because the reality is, I'm sitting here talking to everybody, I'm not out in limbo, the bardo, or anything else fishing for a quarter to call and tell you about it, right? Ideally, as a church of experience, as a church of knowing, we should be able to speak to the things with which we know. And unfortunately for you all, I'm still breathing. So, so I guess, my own spiritual experience, has made, hints, intimations, and, experiences that have led me to form individual ideas, about the afterlife, or about what's next. But it's something generally I keep to myself, because I wear a collar, not just because of this chair, but because I wear a collar, and people are always excited to join a church that isn't literal. It's like the whole thing, it's like, well, do you take scripture literally or figuratively? The answer is we take it seriously. And I stole that from somebody, but I don't care. They deserve to have it stolen from them. And so they're always excited to join something that is more mythical, more symbolic, less literal, less spoon-fed, but people still have a desire to kind of get a more clear and definitive answer. And so people will find that it's refreshing that we don't define those things for people. But at the same time, some of the things that we don't define are also literally issues of life and death, because they're matters of personal conscience. The one thing, we do agree on, and this is something that Bray did an excellent talk years ago, actually not that many years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago in Denver, when we dedicated a conclave to pastoral issues. and he was talking about chaplaincy, midwife of souls, and last rites. I mean, we all agree that, and Tony asked some very probing questions about that to help us get to the bottom of our theology. And that discussion is all there in the recording, which we've retained. So you can hear us debate it in real time. We're not scared of transparency. And it was good questions to ask, that if we're not defining the afterlife, if the church doesn't have a definitive position, why is unction so important? Why is somebody attending to somebody in their last moment so important? If it's not potentially a matter of salvation in the next life, or as a matter of reincarnation, or any other kind of thing. And that's, and our importance placed on that is not necessarily the judgment we make about the afterlife. It's the value we place on the living, that we don't want people to be alone, right? And, we may not know, or at least we may not define or put out for other people as a definitive thing what comes after this, but we're determined to use the tools at our disposal to provide them with the best spiritual preparation, the best mental preparation, the best community preparation to take that step into the unknown. We can't go, we will all go there, but we, in our own time. But individually, we can't go with them. So it's incumbent on us, as a community of caring people, to accompany people up to the threshold. So we don't make that determination for other folks. There are clergy and lay members in the church who take a view of reincarnation or rebirth. There are other folks who prefer to view the pleroma as a kind of heaven type thing, like a substitution for the kingdom of heaven. There are others who take union with God as a dissolution, right? Whichever one of those things it turns out to be, somebody will go into that experience a little bit better for having the care and the accompaniment of their community. So we tend to place our focus on the living, and and I hope when my own thing comes, I have that same preparation. Now that said, if I do have to be, if I am floating around in the nether realms, as it were, and I do have a quarter, or if they haven't abolished payphones where I'm going, I will be certain to dial into the nearest AJC seance and inform people so they can establish a new thing. But I'm pretty sure also once they look at the caller ID and they realize it's me, somebody's probably going to hang up. So it's like, oh, that guy, it took like 30 years to get rid of him. Let it go to voicemail. We're screening calls now. So the answer is it's left up to the individual experience, right? And no matter what that experience is, they still have to wrestle with it, in this life, and that in itself takes a lifetime to work out. So I think it's better that there's a book that I'm reading right now by a fantastic Zen teacher, and he's also a Quaker. He's also a Christian Quaker. A guy by the name of Genjo Marinello from Seattle. I've listened to his podcast for years, and he talks about awakening and maturity and spiritual companionship. He's a spiritual director, and and he talks about the question of death and whatnot. But the catchphrase for the book is essentially what's the answer. There is no knowing. Let's find out together. So my approach historically, when people have come to me with, whether it's an abstract question or one related to the direct experience of losing somebody or folks in danger of their own death, is to say, I don't have an answer for you. I don't know myself. However, you do have a partner in that journey, and I will walk with you until we figure one out. And so that's my own approach. I mean, that said, we do welcome our clergy. If there are clergy who do speak to specific, possibilities and experiences with regard to their own spiritual experience and the afterlife, they are free to teach from that perspective. And many do. The only thing we ask them to do is to distinguish their own experience and their own position from that of the church's position, right? We want people to offer from their own experience. We're a Gnostic church. So talk about things in the language that you know, about the things that you know. Just where the church has a position and the individual priest has a position, just make sure you're clear about what's what, right?
And I'm the only one who's actually been dead, so I can field those questions.
Unfortunately,
I forgot that. Yeah, it wasn't us. We didn't do it.
It didn't take. I tried. It wasn't for me.
Yeah, that was just that was really well said. I always say that if you have a question and somebody can answer it, or you can learn so much more by exploring 5 different answers and really getting in depth to each one of those answers. And so sometimes having the teachers say, well, the door is red because of this, it closes you off so much from being able to explore different reasons of why the door might be red and what that could mean. So yeah, I really like that.
Well, and we're spiritual seekers and members ourselves, right? We have spiritual journeys of our own, and we choose to do them here. Yes, we choose also to serve in holy orders, but we still have our own experiences to reconcile and work through. I mean, this is why I participate in the Gnostic discussion going on at St. Sarah's every other Sunday as a guy in the pews, and why I listen into Bray Weaver's homilies, right? You know what I mean? Because there's a spiritual need for myself also. And so, I still have questions, right? And so I like to participate in the same soup that everybody else does. And the answers that I find in common with the community are also more meaningful to me, right? There's an old saying, tell me and I'll forget, show me and I might remember, involve me and I'll understand. So having that process, not just from me to you, but from you to anybody else in this room, so to speak, or me to anybody else in this room, it has that kind of involved me quality. Angie had her hand up for a bit. Sorry, Angie, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I've asked this question of a couple individuals, but I'd like to hear the panel sort of speak on it. So with the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, if you're not feeling the Father part of that phrase, what are other options, or how can we approach the multitude of ways of expressing that?
There's a bunch of, that's a really, and this is, I encourage everybody to jump in on this one, not just the
goal is,
yeah. There's a variety of language, and I think, and much of it is actually present in the sacramentary. We have a whole plethora of different answers to the question depending on the ritual you're doing. Of course, there's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. There's the more kind of post Vatican II, where are we, Reformation of the Western Church, that is Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, as an option. We don't have that in our liturgy. We don't have it in these liturgies. There was a version of that when I was ordained in one of our liturgies, so it's not completely alien. There's also the pleroma, the word and the thought is another one. I know that's one that I first encountered from Monsignor Jordan, and we put that in the sacramentary. That's actually found in a lot of the rites where you have oil being blessed, altars being consecrated, chalices being consecrated. We include that in a lot of those rites. There's a whole bunch of options. So yeah, I would, I'd love to go around the room on that one. Those are just the ones off the top of my head.
No going around the room appears to be happening.
I got one. I do
I'm drawing a blank,
the invisible spirit, the first thought, and the self-generated sometimes from the Secret Book of John. It's clunky, but it sounds worse in Greek when I say it.
Everything sounds better in Greek.
There's also Pleroma, Logos, and Pneuma Hagion.
I guess for me, talking about the first person of the Trinity as Father is it's an artifact of Jesus languaging the Father himself as the Son and the first person as the Father, and that's an image which is great. for me, the first person of the Trinity is I sometimes use terms like the Most High, the antecedent of time, the One, the depth, the silence. It depends for an individual whether the felt relationship to that person feels fatherly exactly, but that's one option of how that. Father's a relational term, not a ontological term, I think. So how does that relationship feel? So I think for me the approach would be to try some of those different terms out and get a sense of what that transcendent one without a second what that sense of that might be for you, and then to develop your own sense of how to name that relationship. It's different. I mean, what other folks are talking to a liturgical language for invoking the Trinity, and that's valuable to use collectively, but as always, my concerns about how this lands in your own psyche and how that wakes you up. So and so similarly with the Son, right? Like the second person is that which whatever exists before time, space, and reality figuratively births in the human being. Son is one name for that relationship, sure, but I there are others, and depending on one's experience, gender, then I think other names for that would be quite legitimate, and perhaps non-gendered, non-human versions of that. So the self-created, or the solely born, or the undivided one, or something. Cynthia Bourgeois got some nice stuff around that. You're specifically asking about the Father, though, as a term and that person, Angie. Can I clarify?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is sort of one part seeking the more feminine leaning as
Right.
opposed to just exchanging father and mother, but the other part thinking about when our dear friend Bernadette Roberts talks about it, she says that using the term the Son, not using the terms, but thinking of it as the sun, as in the fireball in the sky, the sun, the heat, and the light, of those three things being one, but you can identify the three separate things and just kind of find a flow with that where they're not so separate. But then also trying to grapple with, do I need femininity in my language? What would that femininity look like? Because just switching father for mother doesn't actually solve that particular problem. But then also having an appreciation for the feminine in our spirituality without having any acknowledgement of it in the words we speak also feels somehow lacking. And so I'm just trying to bridge that, and that's also why I'm looking for the panel approach.
One of the things that I found interesting, and this isn't from this tradition, it's actually from the Taoist internal alchemy and acupuncture that I do. But the Father in that tradition would come in as part of the 8 extraordinary meridians and through the Changmai. It is at once the totality of energy and also how that mixes with the ancestry. That then separates out into the Renmai and the Du-mai, that are the yin and the yang elements there, as controlled through the kidneys. So it is it does show that same emanationistic kind of attributes of this totality of unity, and also how it separates off into masculine and feminine at that place there. And there are some things about that I really like, because it takes it into the level of archetypes as opposed to the level of gender. And I think that oftentimes we get very confused when we start to say, well, let's talk about the feminine. And women around me go, well, that doesn't define my experience. And the answer is that it shouldn't. It shouldn't define your experience. What it should do is it should typify an archetypal energy. And as you understand that archetypal energy, you can understand how it moves within you. in that particular case, it's everything that's hidden, but it's also everything that's vital, like all of the vital organs. All the organ pairs are defined by their yin partner. It is the yin partner that defines the relationship and the yang partner that actually activates and moves in the world. There's all sorts of things like that that happen when you're able to remove it from the identity of gender and move it into the identity of archetypes. And sometimes it helps. I mean, when I sit around even in Martinist lodges sometimes and say, well, let's talk about the feminine, people have a tendency to get very triggered. If I say, let's talk about what's yin, all of a sudden we have a much more pleasant conversation. And I think that it has to do with the identification of what that means to us internally and what that means, well, geez, am I being man enough if I extol these yin qualities? Am I being, sufficient enough if I do these things? And I see the inverse of that happening too. And sadly, and one of the things that Karen brings up frequently, if I can mansplain for her for a moment. She's laughing in the background. One of the things that she brings up frequently is that when you look at them in archetypes, one of the things that she would like to do is create value in the archetype of the feminine or in the archetype of the yin, as opposed to trying to make that archetype equivalent to the yang. It's not, it would be equivalent to saying, well, can 90% of women out arm wrestle 90% of men? What the hell does that matter? Let yin be yin and let yang be yang. And the only thing that prevents that from really occurring is when we have an emotional investment in it. So I think that there's some things about moving away from that entire frame and looking at it in a different cultural expression that doesn't fit it the same way.
Yeah, I was going to ask the kind of, well, how would you clarify that? How would you break that into three things? Because outside of that context, I also tend to lose my way, I guess. So how would you break that into three archetypes? But then it occurred to me, well, no, that really taps into kind of what Tim was saying about finding, I guess, your own relation to it. I've got a separate thing, but it can wait till later. I was going to, because I saw Joanne's thing about voice, sound, and word that I thought was interesting, because it takes it directly out of that same kind of, I don't know if paradigm's the right word, but that structure. Because right now we're talking about, replacing another structure with an equivalent thing for the thing of language. But how do you, like Bray says, how do you actually address beyond that kind of concept? And I don't have a ready answer for it. There was one thing that I was going to mention. Maybe I'll get people to chew on. We'll get back to what Bray and Angie were saying, but there's also divine beloved, but we also tend to use that more of the Godhead, the Trinity as a whole, than as an individual. Sorry. Yeah, I guess I don't I had a little bit harder of a time following that part, but I think I know where you're going. I just don't know how to get there.
To go off of what Bray was just saying there, I think if you look at it, like we had the Jungian discussion yesterday, and if you look at it like a spectrum of divine masculine, divine feminine, you can't ignore either side, and you can almost view the sun as like what that creates, right? And that's you, and you're somewhere along, as we know today. We see today gender as this spectrum, right? And it's not just one or the other, but it's somewhere in the middle. And I think that you can also, it's not quite like the full triangle. It's more like a line that you're somewhere in. But you get like he was saying, if you completely ignore one aspect of that, it's going to become this shadow of you. And I don't think you can do that either.
I think we found our next project. Angie is working on a female mystics project. So perhaps the next project is to kind of explore those archetypes and tripartite, I guess, archetype, or perhaps a more unified thing. It would be interesting, and I don't know if Scott is in here, because Scott was the one who took the language and standardized it across the sacramentary to a degree. We didn't want to have too many different terms in there. We wanted, each of our rituals to sound like our other rituals to a certain degree. But he might know, all the official ways that we have, so that you can actually set them aside and take a look at kind of what's outside that boundary in a way that Ray and Christian are talking about.
Yeah, I think the question, as the conversation has progressed, the question really is how to express the yin more in our ritual, because it is. I don't notice it the same way that I would. How do I put it? Like when we do our mass or whatever, I don't notice it in there. And I'm not saying that we just have to throw in word salad to placate everybody, but it's sort of how do we gently bring it forward, because what I feel like in our organization, I mean, the fact that I'm sitting here in collar, it's valued. It's not that it's not valued. It's just sort of how do we move it forward a little bit more without trying to play the equivalency game, because if somebody just sort of walked in and sat, like taking your grandmother to service, and your grandmother happens to want to hear something about that, it's not there as so much. Does that make sense?
It does make sense to me, because I think that incorporating the language is really just the very first tiny little step, and I think it's an important step, right? I mean, because it, in some very real sense, it normalizes the idea that the feminine, or that pole, is part of the Godhead. But I think if we just stop there, then we're doing lip service. And so I think the question that you're asking is exactly the question we need to be asking, because it has to go beyond that.
So what might actually, I think you're sort of getting to, sort of what I'm feeling is that we're doing more than playing lip service, but nobody else knows that unless you've been in seminary for 2 years, right? So I think that's kind of a problem, because
I'd agree. Yeah.
How do it sort of also goes back to the earlier question of bringing more people in, and the quality, not just the quantity, but there are more men than women in this conversation right now, and so one of the ways to bring more women in is to let it known that we're actually in a room of feminists, right? Where you wouldn't think that right off the bat. Joanne, I see you nodding your head with me. And so I guess what I'm saying is how do we as an organization pay more lip service to the work that's actually being done? And that can be a conversation for later, but I at least wanted to make sure that it's sort of being talked about in forums like this. Yeah.
I think there are areas and things that we have that are prominent and have been used, but are also regional or not fully whatever. Like, to talk about the stuff that we're already doing. 2 examples of those, and I mean, we're looking at the lowest denominator of that, in terms of the language or even the expression of the thinking behind the language, but that's still important, right? That's the foot in the door. I mean, we've got 2 things that have now been around for a few years, but at the same time, they're not equally distributed or equally used across the church. And this is where we clash up against freedom of conscience and priests building communities out of their own experience and the language with which we're familiar. So it's one of those things where, it takes money to make money. It takes people to invest themselves in that expression in order to put it out there to attract that expression. So and those two things I can think of off the top of my head, of course, are the Divine Feminine service that they do at St. Mary's, and our seventh official liturgy, the Sophianic Eucharist, which doesn't get used enough, right? Those, those two things. I mean, I do them at specific times here. Oh, remember when we used to get together in church for liturgy? Yeah, I mean, I've done it here, but not nearly as often as I should. But that's also at the same time, as things progress. For example, with your own journey, there's an opportunity to do that, not with my voice, but with your voice, right? Like as a priest, I'll be getting the hell out of your way and letting you do it, because then I can take a night off. But but there's a thing, rather, I don't want to say the words for you. I don't want to say the expression for you. I want you to be able to take the liturgies and the expressions that are, in common with, our community, but expressed through your experience and voice. And the opportunity to do that is you. It's Joanne. It's Karen. It's, that, and I think that, much like what I was talking about growth earlier, that occurs organically. We're having that come up more, like St. Mary's developing the service, like Monsignor Jordan bringing the Sophianic Eucharist in, which is a combination between our Mass and Rosamund Miller's Mass. And having those opportunities, not just having a kind of minimum standard, well, we should at least do this. Seek out opportunities that are useful for things that are best expressed with that voice. I mean, I tried to do that years ago by saying, hey, you know what? If we're celebrating, if we're celebrating the Divine Feminine, if we're celebrating a female saint or mystic, we should be doing it using these liturgies, not the other rituals, right? We should honor them contextually in that context. And I don't think that was a bad idea. I think that was a decent idea on my part, but, creating follow through and familiarity, is something that's not possible for me to do alone. It also requires the impulse from the ground to do it. So, for folks who want to explore that more, I say absolutely go nuts. As soon as I can, reasonably within all the standards that we've talked about with lineage, put the appropriate stoles on people to allow them to do it rather than me to do it on their behalf, the better, right? So, so part of that, the communal journey in that regard is also linked to the individual journey in that regard. And that might be a bit of a pain in the ass. But once that does come around, I think it will. I think that allowing that pace or growing that at that speed in that fashion will allow for that authenticity rather than shoehorning it or rather than me trying to write for a character whose experience I do not share at all, I guess. If that makes sense.
If I can interject some things on this that come not from my addled male brain, but from the much more beautiful brain of late Dr. Eimer. She was in a very interesting situation in the AJC because I remember at a conclave she was literally within 5 minutes of each other, told that number one, she was only a subdeacon because her husband was the bishop, and that she was taking advantage of her proximity to power in order to get an office. And then, as I said, literally not 5 minutes later, she was told that she was only a subdeacon because it was a boys' club and the boys' club was keeping her down. Which means every woman, to a greater or lesser extent, in an organization like this is damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's always going to be somebody who is going to question your value and question your contribution, or undermine it in some very real way. The other thing that she pointed out to me that I thought was incredibly insightful was one of the reasons that she believed that we have so few female seminarians, and that even fewer complete the work and move on to ordination, is because in an organization like this, the clergy is called upon to do a lot of unpaid emotional labor. And in our society, women are called upon to do a whole hell of a lot of unpaid emotional labor to begin with. And that for many women, and I don't know how true this is, because I'm not speaking with my own voice here. It's just too much. It's just too much to ask that the demands that are made on women in our society, coupled with the demands that are made on members of the clergy, just becomes overwhelming. So I think that, as I said in the chat, if I'm 100% honest, I don't think we're even close to where we want to be yet in addressing this. I think we're still too close to the start of this project, but it's going to be everybody's job to carry the ball forward.
So I will the emotional labor piece just quick, and I'm going to gently push back on it. So I'm home with my two young children. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I've worked outside of the home. I would say that the unpaid emotional labor, I mean, that's the easy part. That's frankly the easy part. The tricky part is sorry, I'm just trying to think of how to say this gently, and if it doesn't come out gently, that sometimes a masculine approach to talking about theological matters doesn't leave room for the emotional to express sometimes. So the emotional labor, that is easy. We've got that. Like I I circle with a lot of other women that have young children, and we emotional labor for one another constantly. We emotional labor for our friends and our partners and everybody else. I talk about, like, if somebody comes into my circle of care, like, good luck for you, because now you're in my circle of care. It might take a while to get in there, but once you're in there, too bad for you. So again, that part is easy, but it is definitely, even in this context where I'm being supported, it is difficult to push back on the intellectual level in the same way. And I think that can be, not that I am incapable, I'm writing my papers, I'm doing my thing, but that is definitely a tricky space. You see on Facebook all the time, women do not speak up because they do not have time for the nonsense. They don't want to go toe to toe. They don't want to play the game. Joanne's clapping. We have no problem with caring for people, but we do have a problem if we say something and going toe to toe. And I'm going toe to toe with you now, but in a more public setting like Facebook, I'm not going to. You will hardly ever see me comment on Facebook, not because I don't have something to share, but because I don't want to be slapped back if my opinion's slightly different. And again, that's the trickier part. That's, I think, going to be the harder part to make room, because we are such, Karen's too, we are such an intellectually focused organization. And again, I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow. I'm not criticizing that, and you're going to hear why tomorrow. However, just trying to find that balance between maintaining the intellectual integrity and Dr. Elmer, she was definitely holding her own, being doctor. You know,
Yeah, you had no problems with the intellectual part, right?
But as far as the sort of back and forth and the confrontational thing, like, I'm never going to do it. I don't care what my title is. I will not do it. And it's not because I can't, but that's what I don't have time for. So I guess I would just say the part of caring, like, that's the easy part. That flows. Like, we're trained and socialized to a fault to do that job. And part of my journey with ministry is going to learn how to not do that so much, right? Like, that's going to be something that I'm going to have to pay attention to, which I'm looking forward to learning. But just some thoughts to put out there in the forum. And again, I'm really appreciative of the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that. It's lovely for me to hear that, because, as I say, I'm sort of not speaking with my own voice, and I have to simply plead ignorance. So
I was going to say that's very awesome to hear, and that I'm going to use that to underline my point earlier where I talked about growth of the church. Growth of the clergy is in the same way. I'm not going to reach over you to try and do that. My job is to try and empower you to do that, because you're the best position to do it. Specifically in this example that we're talking about, I don't mess with the experts in that regard. There is one thing, because Mar Thomas had mentioned Subdeacon Juliana, that I wanted to add to our conversation, actually going before that point, talking about archetype and gender, but also something that Father John had raised in the comments, because we have the statement of principles, but you're not required to believe all of those. And some people put more weight on different ones than others. So it's also important to note, because Father John had pointed it out, that Father John is not a Trinitarian, for example, and he said, he tries to take that expression out of the Trinity or the Godhead, as a part of, his own expression of the divine, which I bundle that all, and I come back to Mar Thomas mentioning Juliana, and it occurs to me that the talk that didn't get out into the world was that Juliana had done a talk on the divine neuter. And we've talked about, we've talked about the masculine and the feminine and the archetype, but there's also the neuter, and that's something eventually in time that I would like to see explored. Will, I have to get you a copy of that talk so you can listen to it, and if you're comfortable with it, and I imagine that listening to it is going to be a thing, right? So you take as long as you need, and you have the veto there. But it is a different kind of expression. We're talking about kind of going beyond the boundary of our own language and our own expression, and exploring these different things that occur in our ritual and beyond. The stuff that's a human reality experience, right? And that's one of them. So I would also like to see that aspect get out there. And I suspect, at least as I recall, because that was Conclave back in Chicago, that may have been Juliana's aim as well. And, and I can't remember the gist of the talk. I do know it was a two-parter, and I've got both parts, but I think that would be good to add into the mix, because it'll also help us shape our thoughts about everything we have talked about here, in addition to the stuff that we haven't explored. That's what I got. Just catching up on the chat. Oh, and talking about fights and stuff online and pushback and stuff like that. I don't ever get around to them, right? Like, I'm the guy that has the definitive ability to stop anybody bickering simply with the delete button or the off button or whatever. And I don't do that. Sometimes I load up social media and I nope the heck out of there really quick. It's like, no, nothing will be improved by me taking the patriarchal, paternalistic, whatever, and in order for reconciliation and conversations to be honest and sincere and come together, folks to have a come to Jesus, it can't be because I smack their heads together. So there are times where, I'm like, no, I don't want to get involved. in that. And there are other times where simply my time is dominated by, you're not going to believe this, but it's on the website. You're not going to believe this, but Father Tony wrote a book. You're not going to believe this, we've got a video on it, right? Like, that's like 90% of my job now. So, you know what I mean? Is to point out the stuff we already have rather than fight. Sorry, that was a thing, but I wanted to address some of the stuff great stuff that went by in the chat. And of course, the fact that Father John is the minority voice, at least in this conversation about being non-Trinitarian, though we did discuss it in Will's talk on the Trinity some years ago, the fact that we have some folks who are Unitarian.
I'm a big man on the whole thing myself.
More questions? We are actually officially over the allotted time. I'm okay to go longer. Another 15, 20 would probably do nicely, or we can wrap it. John has returned.
Do you think that you can start a topic that will be over in 15 to 20 minutes?
Probably not.
Not gonna happen.
I can't even talk.
Just saying.
Restricted to
Bray,
15.
we talk on Mondays. I can't even talk about the weather in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I'm totally cool going longer, but yeah, 15, 20 minutes is ambitious.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I think what we'll do is we will cap it at that. I think that there's a lot of great stuff in there. Yeah, I think we should have one of these, every conclave, if not every 6 months. We used to have a question box on the website in the time of my predecessor, but that just disappeared. I think actually he just stopped answering them, or he stopped writing himself questions. Sorry, I'll edit that part out of talk. Yeah, did I say that? I don't know that that's actually true. Besides, he has great answers to questions. There's a lot of things where I have ribbed my predecessor in talks. The one thing I will always say about him is he is a great teacher. A lot better than me, but I leave the teaching to the teachers. So with that, we will. I've paid him a compliment on tape. I guess we'll leave that in. With that, we will wrap it up. And I think that this is something. I think we've officially started a series for Conclave Talk now. So I think we will wrap that up, and we will look towards the morning, 9 a.m., which will be Jonathan Stewart talking about the return of the divine feminine in the modern Gnostic era, specifically with modern Gnostic churches in the cult revival and the restoration. So in place of his Sufi and the Gospel of John talk. And then following that, I think we have Joe Revels on evangelical Christianity and Gnosticism, which promises to be a hoot. Bring your sweet tea.